Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the NUS Institute of Real Estate and Urban Studies e-seminar, Investing for Good, Doing Things Right or Doing the Right Things. My name is Simi and I'm honored to be your host for today. Before we commence, here are a few things to take note of. Firstly, for technical support, please drop us a message via WhatsApp at +65 9131 2301. Secondly, for Q&A, please leave your questions in the Zoom Q&A function. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Sig Lee Huat, who will open the session with a welcome speech. Dr. Sig is the board chairman of the NUS Institute of Real Estate and Urban Studies, as well as chair professor practice of real estate at the National University of Singapore. He's also chairman of GLP's Fund Management Advisory Board. Dr. Sig, please.
Well, good afternoon, good evening, maybe good morning to everyone around the world. This webinar is really about doing good while doing well while doing good in business. And in this case, today is about the real estate business. And I seem to be looking at the wrong side. Okay. Sorry, I don't have the screen. I can't get the screen on my computer. So you just have to live with whatever you see out there. So you see that I'm asked to just give a few opening remarks, and I won't be too long. I think you don't really want to hear from me, really more from the panel of experts that will assemble here today. So the good thing is that the business world is increasingly showing a willingness to be more seriously doing the right things by society. Now, this is a relatively new phenomenon. The ESG movement started off really as a niche area, and I would say mainly from Europe. It's now mainstream and global. Until relatively recently, business corporates, probably more so in the US, saw their sole responsibility as protecting the interests of shareholders. While Milton Friedman, famous doctrine that's founded in 1970, provided the theoretical underpinnings. The doctrine say that the social responsibility of business is to increase profits. He argued that a company has no social responsibility to the public or society. Its only responsibility is to shareholders. Now, clearly, this was music to the ears of business people, and this has been the guiding principle for decades. However, in the 20th century, especially since the GFC, big businesses began to sense the pressure from society and see for themselves the social ills resulting from the disparity in wealth and income, and also disastrous consequences of climate change are real. So a good indication of this change is a few years ago, a group of business leaders gathered at a roundtable conference in Washington, DC, where the principle of business having a wider responsibility inclusive of all stakeholders and not just shareholders is formally agreed. Now, one of the key stakeholders obviously is society. ESG is now taken seriously by the business world because business leaders has come to the realization that in the long run, it is good for business. It is heartening to see such a sea change of attitudes globally in embarrassing responsible investing. But there is much to be done. ESG is evolving and still early days. There are many outstanding issues and challenges that including setting disclosure standards and measurement and verification of impact and so on. However, it is encouraging that many industry and professional bodies are taking up different courses for the purposes of translating ESG principles into practice. All in all, there's much closer scrutiny, and it is harder to get away from greenwashing. Now, but would these be enough to expect all companies to do the right things? I think the answer is never enough. If the outcome of COP26 is any indication, it's definitely not enough. A lot of commitments and pledges were made, but not much. But how much or how many of them will be translated into actions? If past records is any indication, it is not encouraging. Our sector or industry, i.e. real estate, has a huge responsibility to do our part. We have inherited a huge carbon footprint. The industries have stepped up and taken actions to reduce carbon emissions. But to my mind, we are still behind the curve. Even though building sustainable structures is not new in the industry, and LEED certification has been around for 30 years. I doubt if carbon reduction or removal has been mainstream in our industry. For instance, we will need a change of mindset to fundamentally shift from the traditional way of evaluating investments to responsible investing, guided by ESG principles. Hopefully, sustainability and carbon emissions, as well as ESG criteria, will be routinely incorporated as key consideration in investments deal underwriting by all. Well, I'm only supposed to make a few opening remarks, and I certainly don't intend to steal the thunder from the panel of experts assembled here today. To kickstart the event, we are pleased to have Lisette van Doorn, CEO of ULI Europe, to kickstart as the fire starter and speak on the subject of Zoom in the S in ESG, a roadmap for social value. Joining us today, we also have a panel of distinguished speakers from the real estate and finance industry. They will discuss and exchange views of how the real estate and investment community could do things right, and do the right things to promote ESG outcome for society. Over to you, Lisette.
It is with great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, CEO of ULI Europe, Ms. Lisette van Doorn, to deliver her fast starter presentation on Investing for Good, European Experience. As Chief Executive of ULI Europe, she is responsible for the development of the Institute's activities across the region, including its renowned pan-European conferences and over 250 local meetings and events across 14 countries. Prior to ULI, Lisette ran her own real estate consulting business and was also the country manager for CBRE Global Investors, as well as founding chief executive for IREUS, the European Association for Investors in Non-Listed Real Estate Vehicles. She was also the managing director of research and strategy for ING Real Estate Investment Management Europe. Ms. Lisette, please.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Let me start with sharing my screen. 1 second. Almost there. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to present on this, what we think is an important piece of work. I think Dr. Siek, you touched on many of the topics that, all relevant topics, I think, that are we need to address when looking at ESG more broadly, and especially looking at the social side more particularly. What I'll do in the next 15 minutes is talk about a specific project we did by looking more into the S in ESG. We've seen a lot of work happening in the past decades on mostly the E, and still the S part is much more unexplored. Before going into kind of the specifics of the report, I would kind of start a bit also with a historic perspective, similar to what Dr. Sieg just presented. And I wanted to take an urban perspective, a city perspective, and see who contributed to improving the living circumstances and welfare in those cities. And if you look, I didn't go back centuries, but I started, say, at the time industrialization happened. And then we saw in different parts of the world, company towns being started. And obviously there are positive angles and less positive angles to that. But what I tried to do is increase the living conditions of mostly industrial workers by providing sometimes affordable housing, sports facilities, education for children, sometimes with the idea to, if you take well care of your people, you also, that results in your company results. And then, of course, we saw, say, around the 30s, end of the 20s, and also after the Second World War, we saw the state stepping in more, providing welfare state programs, and we saw a rise of the middle class to that, and more kind of that role that companies took, say, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, more taken over by the state. And what we've been seeing happening in the last few decades is that welfare state programs have been reduced again, ongoing austerity and even increasing austerity in many cases, where some of the roles in some countries more than in others, some of the roles that state used to play, at least how many of us are aware of it, has been taken over or needs to be taken over by corporates again. And we see a discussion of the reinvention of capitalism. We obviously also see social unrest and war for talent, where in the past people followed the jobs. That's not the case anymore. And I think it's very important to keep this in mind. Is you may wonder what does this have to do with us as the real estate industry? I think what's important to understand is the real estate industry owns the built environment. And I think by owning that built environment, or at least large parts of it, it brings a responsibility to the welfare of cities and how it adds to people's well-being. And that obviously is very different from, say, a century, 2 centuries ago, when there was not a proper real estate industry. Let's move on. What we've seen happening over the last couple of years is that increasing social concerns. This slide is taken from the most recent Emerging Trends in Real Estate report that ULI annually undertakes together with PwC. And this is taken from the European report, which we've just launched 3 weeks ago. This picture has been very consistent over the last few years, where especially social issues like housing affordability, social inequality, have been steadily increasing over the last couple of years. And especially striking in an environment where you see there's a lot to be concerned about. And of course, also on environmental issues. So it's the broader ESG that's very much high on the agenda. And then if you look at the purple bars, you see that even increasing over the next 5 years. What is driving this bigger focus on ESG? Actually, it's all of us. It's the individuals who are driving this. I also visited COP, and I think that was, for me, one of the most important learnings. It's the push won't come from governments. It's individuals, businesses, society that needs to step up. And I think that's what we've already seen happening with the drive for ESG. It's also not been regulation so far. It's us being, and especially I would say the younger people among us, who kind of are more conscious about the company they want to work for, the goods they buy, where it comes from, how it's resourced, how it's grown, how it's produced. And using their voices much more, being much more vocal about that. Consumers, those individuals are not just consumers, but they also work somewhere, and they get much more critical about the company they work for, the values of the company, whether that suits their individual values. And climate, social impact play such a much more important role in that. And most of these individuals also save for their pensions, and that's how they put pressure on their pension funds to invest the money, not only yielding a solid return, but also helping to build further society. But then the next question is, are we ready for all of this? This has been taken from previous year's Emerging Trends report, where we asked how the real estate can make the biggest difference through impact investing. And that was specifically focused on the social side. Interestingly, if you ask that question, most of the focus is still around the environmental side. And of course, there's still a lot that needs to be done there. The social side is much lower on the agenda. While over 2/3 thought that reducing the environmental impact of the built environment, the industry could make the biggest difference. Designing places that take well-being and mental health into account, focus on social infrastructure, or increasing the levels of housing for different income levels, all scored around 1/3, so much lower on the agenda. And this is something we consistently see. There's interest, but there's also a lot of struggle. And what's then needed to move forward and increase this focus and better incorporate this in corporate strategies? These were the things that I mentioned most: a better understanding of the risk-return profile. Also, many of the topics that Dr. Siek already mentioned: better ability to measure impact and how impact investing is defined. So it's really basics that we're talking about. And what we notice is that the current vocabulary, for example, related to how we measure return, how we measure risk, is not incorporating these elements. And that is something where we think more work needs to be done. And that's how we came to do this report, a roadmap for social value in real estate. The project was kindly sponsored by some of you as corporate members. So when we started, the first question obviously was defining social value. And while it's a hot topic at the moment, it's definitely not new. While Friedman said early 20th century, Schumpeter was even earlier, I think in 1905, speaking about social value. And basically that what he said was the value is placed on something that's good for society, not on something that's good for the individual. Key words are culture and values underpinning social value creation, being civic-minded. We talk a lot about ESG, but what ESG actually is more from an internal corporate perspective focused, you could say, risk management or say approach. SDGs, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, go one level further and look at what is really good for society. And that is actually, we see this as a trajectory where ESG, we come from CSR, we move on to ESG, and SDGs are the next level. Ultimately, it's about enhancing the prospects and well-being of places and people. And one thing I think is very important to realize is how the real estate industry has evolved over the last couple of years, where it basically has become a global asset, a global financial sector. And creating social value is by definition local. It needs a very local approach. It's a very subjective approach, and it's nowhere the same. I just want to quickly mention one example that I think is very striking. I met a real estate value add manager, private equity, based in the UK of some time ago. And he told me, I really want to do good. And I really found a niche investing in youth clubs across the UK because they've all been taken away because of austerity measures in the past. He said, the only thing I'm looking for is one company basically to manage all of those youth clubs for me. And I think that is exactly where the difficult thing is. It's not one size fits all. You need to have local people knowing the local circumstances and what should be done. And I think that is an additional factor complicating the creation of social value. What is really important when creating social value is look at the context. And with real estate going through the whole value chain of planning, development, design, construction, up until management and operations, it's very important to think about the horizon that you have in mind. And social value in the context of planning and development is totally different from management and operations. Ultimately, social value would benefit from taking that long-term perspective, because ultimately the real value is only created when the building is in operation. Only when you have a sole development focus, you will look at it differently. You have different stakeholders to take into account, and it's often much more around creating employment opportunities for local people or for certain parts of society that don't have as many chances as others have. While if you look at it, and of course the mix of use is really important, because the key thing is, if you don't have the proper perspective at the development phase, it's very hard to fix it in the management and operations phase later on. The two need to go hand in hand. And actually this is almost a plea for whenever development is done to take that long-term perspective. Because ultimately the real social value comes out over the longer term. And interestingly enough, what we have not developed yet is the pricing element of what is that added value if I put in the right ingredients to create the social value later on in the process. Now it's nowhere in the valuation. So basically what we did is, interestingly enough, we looked at all the different frameworks and tools that are already available. If we go back to how we started to deal with energy efficiency, we heard about LEED before. There was nothing when we started, say, about 2 decades ago. Then gradually those certifications came, portfolio reporting frameworks emerged, etc. When looking at social value, the environment is totally different. We analyzed more than 100 frameworks and tools. So there's a lot out there. The key challenge almost is what to use when. So what we try to do is come up with a framework helping to defining goals and objectives, aligning the KPIs to those goals and objectives, measuring, managing, and reporting, looking at different ways to do that. And obviously also looking at the exit of the investment, which is a key area not really taken into consideration yet. And what we did is looked across all those frameworks and tools and classified them, and also looked at what do they focus on. Is it just one country? Is it just development? Is it investment management? And what phase is it best suited for? If you want to know more about that, I would recommend for you to look at the report, because it's quite a big piece of work. And then before I close my presentation, I would like to share a couple of really inspiring examples. Actually, the challenging thing was to find, say, older projects where this has happened. We see a lot going on right now, but a lot of that is still either in planning or development phase. Not a lot has been finished already, or not been properly measured already. Just some, ECLA is a regeneration in Molenbeek, Belgium. Molenbeek is basically the poorest urban district in Brussels. And you may have heard of it in relation to terrorist attacks some couple of years ago in Brussels. A developer bought a plot in the area before anyone else went in, and kind of through active community engagement regenerated a part. Argent, King's Cross in London, not only focusing on the buildings, but also the public space, the realm, this sort of social tenants. One of the main anchors ultimately became a university. We have UN 17 Village in Copenhagen, which is, I think it's under construction now. It's just finalizing planning at the moment. That's supposed to be a self-containing residential district at the edge of Copenhagen, where the developer wants to apply all the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals through, for example, urban farming, collaborative approaches, etc. And then we have Reinventing Paris, which is already one of the oldest, probably, that started during the GFC to find ways to keep regeneration in Paris going on. And basically the city identified easy, accessible plots for developers to submit proposals for, and that would not only be granted on maximum land value, but what you could contribute to the neighborhood or to the wider city. And then we have C40 de Mer Montreal, which is basically using the same principles. After Reinventing Paris, C40 took on the initiative and kind of did it with a larger group of cities, including Montreal. So now closing with recommendations, because yes, there's much more interest and a bigger need, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And we think for social value to really play out, leadership is key. First of all, of government and public sector at all the different levels. And especially because social value is by definition place-based. You need a location to create the social value. And actually public sector ideally would be best placed to put down that place-based vision and strategy. Also because the real estate industry is immensely fragmented. And only in a very few examples, one real estate owner has a big enough holding in one certain area to be able to make that difference. Often it needs collaboration between many different stakeholders. At the same time, we need stronger corporate leadership, because ultimately creating social value needs to come from the top, through the strategy, through the vision, and filtered down through the organization. We see a lot happening around impact investing at the moment with specific products, which is a great step in the right direction. But we see it as an intermediate step to getting us up to the integration of social value into the organization. We need more transparency, accountability, and data. Ultimately, we don't think it's about more data, because what we've seen a lot is many data are collected, but then companies don't know what to do with it. So therefore, also that structure is very important, of setting the strategy, defining the metrics, what to measure, and how it feeds back into the organization, not only to report, but to improve the process and the social value creation. And then we need innovation. I would like to pick out the part on financial return measurement, because the way we now measure return is not in favor of social value. And what we hear a lot is, I can't sacrifice financial return for creating value. It's not about sacrificing financial return. First of all, I think it's about risk-adjusted returns that we need to look at more specifically. And the other part is a look at a different way of measuring financial return, maybe more of the longer term, because often, yes, on the short term, creating social value may cost money. But over the longer term, it adds to the financial return by, for example, reducing volatility, having less vacancy, etc., etc. that is only just still very difficult to bring out. Education and training, I think, speaks for itself. We need to educate all across the industry about the importance of this and how to do it in practice. And then finally, collaboration. I've already spoken a lot about that. Not only throughout the value chain, we need collaboration, but we also need it between public, private sector, and even other stakeholders beyond real estate. For those of you that are interested in the report, you can find it on ULI's Knowledge Finder. And if you have any more questions, very happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lisette. We'll be starting our panel discussion with our 5 distinguished speakers with the topic, Investing for Good, Doing Things Right or Doing the Right Things. First of all, I'd like to introduce our session moderator, Mr. David Dickinson. David is an adjunct senior research fellow at IREUS and an independent director of Morgan Stanley's Prime Property Fund Asia. Previously, he was the managing director and global head of research and strategic planning with GIC Real Estate, the real estate investment arm of the Government of Singapore Investment Corporation. Welcome, David. With that, I shall now hand over to David. David, please.
Thank you. You can hear me, I guess. I'm not muted. Well, it gives me pleasure to introduce the panel. And we have a very diverse panel today from various areas in our industry. And Lisette, please participate as well. We'd be very interested in your views. So we have a large panel as well. So I'm going to keep the introduction of the 4 panelists quite short. Their backgrounds are, I think, enclosed in the notes that can be sourced for this session. Luca Bertolo, I apologize if I pronounced your name incorrectly. He's the Secretary General of the European Mortgage Federation and European Covered Bond Council. It's morning for him. Han Hui Chin is Senior Vice President with GIC's Real Estate Group in Singapore, and she's involved in research and strategy within that group. Mervyn Tang is Head of Sustainability Strategy within Asia Pacific with Schroders, and Neil Fassam is Managing Partner and Asia Pacific Head of Private Funds at Brookfield Asset Management. Neil is also a board member of IREUS here at NUS. Now, I'm not sure whether the audience has been told, but please send your questions through. I presume that's understood for all. And we will try to get to Q&A either at relevant points through the discussion or at the end. We've got, I think, a little less than an hour, so we'll see how we go. Let me see. I think housekeeping is out of the way. Now, Lisette gave us a very interesting presentation on, I guess, the social side of ESG, although it is very difficult to separate social responsibility in any areas, particularly between environment and social actions, because the two are obviously linked. I looked at those charts that were put up. The first bar chart, it really wasn't surprising, I think, to see that environmental issues rank very highly in the European Emerging Trends report. But what surprised me was that housing and social issues were not so far behind. What was interesting is in a later chart, when it came down to impact investing, that respondents felt that really the environment was probably something that they could have a bigger impact on. Now, maybe that's because environment is just front of mind right at the moment, obviously with COP26 and many other things that have been happening. But is it that, or is dealing with social issues, and for the moment let's put them aside from environment, is it that they are inherently more difficult? I'd really be interested in the panel's ideas here, or just their thoughts. You know, is it more difficult because they are to some extent more subjective? Maybe the views of what are social issues are different in different countries or even cities. This lack of link, or the difficulty in linking them to tangible financial outcomes, you know, is it too much to put in the easy basket? And of course, then there's the lack of government or community pressure. So what did the panel think? Lisette, perhaps you could kick off with any sort of things that you could add. But am I right saying that environment is really just front of mind, or are the other issues associated with social aspects just harder to get your head around?
I do think, David, that environmental is really front of mind still. And obviously we have almost 2 decades kind of advance for that. We've already been dealing with that for so long. And well, recently the sense of urgency has increased radically, with more climate related events, extreme weather events, etc. So I think it's really moving top of mind now. Not only the mitigation part in terms of decarbonization, but especially also managing the real physical risks. And therefore, I think social is still a bit lower on the agenda, although we see it increasing rapidly. And I think the point you mentioned on, is it much harder? I think it is much harder because, as I said before, this is local by definition. So every time again, for every asset, you need to figure out what that means in creating social impact and within its context. And therefore, I think it is much more difficult. What I also think obviously plays a role is there has not been any regulatory pressure in the social side. Much more, the only place where we do see it is to get a development permit. That's often, you need to create a certain percentage of affordable housing, sometimes to even increase the density. So it's almost a trade-off in the permitting stage to add social aspects to get the permit. But that's more, say, a push factor in terms of to get the things done than an inherent belief that we're doing the right thing. Obviously, what you then see later on is that it does add to the quality of the place. So yes, I think it is much harder. But I think that pressure we see now from younger generations, from consumers, I think is pushing things through. The only thing is, how do you make it work in practice with that global approach that many players have, and at the same time that local application of creating that social value and the measurement issues, the reporting issues we've seen.
Yeah, that's interesting. You also mentioned that the public sector really has a crucial and perhaps pivotal role in, I guess, social responsibility, at least either through education or policy or joint ventures, I think, as you mentioned. That's interesting because Singapore is quite unique in this area because some 80% of housing in Singapore is actually provided by a single government entity, and they plan the communities, obviously, and they control the provision of infrastructure, transport, and otherwise. So you do have some models in at least one country where government does have a very, very intensive role in I guess, creating communities and trying to create good outcomes for communities. So
it's interesting because we discuss in Europe, we discuss Singapore a lot, and we kind of look with a big envy to look how great it looks. We have so many social impact and affordability issues. At the same time, it's a model probably hard to replicate in other parts of the world. And that's probably trying to find the balance between that in government interference and regulation and local bottom-up industry participation.
Yes, you're right. Does anyone else want to comment?
Hi, Mervyn here.
Hi, Mervyn.
Yes, I just wanted to jump in here just on my role is looking at asset classes across many different types of asset classes, from real estate to equities to private assets. And I would say the lagging nature of social is not exclusive to real estate. I think in terms of climate change, because of the increasing sophistication of analysis, the availability of metrics, the work of, like Lisette said, on a lot of policymakers focusing on the issue, it does mean that environmental issues has received a lot of focus. But what we have seen coming beyond real estate is that there's increasing focus on certain concepts. So thematic funds targeting particular social issues, often aligned to SDGs. And Schroders, as an asset manager, our clients, asset owners that we speak to, I think both at the institutional investor level and retail investors have been thinking much more about this social issue. I think one of the big challenges is just how diverse social issues can be when we're talking about, I think, social risk analysis as well as social impact analysis. It can range from community relations for minors, it can range from cybersecurity, it could be how a company treats its customers. It's much harder to, when we're thinking about a unified portfolio, to think about social issues in the same way like climate issues, where you can have a similar framework across many different things. So I think that's been a particular challenge. But I think one interesting observation we've had from our global investor survey, or a global institutional investor survey, where we talked to over 700 institutional clients, is that there's an increasing interest in health and wellness as a theme. Environmental is still the top theme, but since the pandemic, health and wellness has increased significantly. So I imagine some of these trends we see will translate to the real estate sector in the future.
Yes, we obviously we haven't talked about COVID, and perhaps that should be left for another session. Our topic's big enough as it is, I guess. I think just moving on to the environmental side of ESG, our industry, I guess this is a debatable point, but at least in recent months, perhaps years in some parts of the world, there has been moves afoot to embrace at least the need for decarbonisation at the industry level, and perhaps not so much amongst certain governments, but I guess that's a different topic. But one of the things that I noticed, and maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me that Europe has been a lot more proactive, both at the industry level and government level, to try to gear up to do things right. Is Europe a roadmap for things to come in other regions? Perhaps I could open it up to the panel. Luca, you might want to kick off with that.
Thank you, David. I think that Europe is trying to change the paradigm of the market by using two big leverage. As Lisette said, the green revolution will happen only if local authorities, government, and the European authorities will cooperate very strongly, and also if they will be able to change the consumer demand. The engine of this revolution will be entering in the house of every single citizen by making the ESG as a reality and a tangible benefit for citizens. I think something is happening. I'm always very optimistic, and also the comment that Melvin did, I think COVID and ESG have to be looked together, because we are changing the paradigm of our market, and probably also for all our house. Unfortunately, I'm not in Singapore with you, but I'm very close to Molenbeek, as Lisette was saying, in Brussels. So this is a sign that our life has changed, and we cannot think like before. I would like just to quote a few words of yesterday evening of the deputy chair of the European Central Bank. I mean, there was an important speech. So he's the head of the supervisory board of the European Central Bank. I would like to quote the words: "Banks urgently need to set ambitious and concrete goals and timelines, including measurable intermediate milestones to mitigate their exposure to current and future climate change risk." So just allow me to, I interpreted these words as a very concrete step forward of the European Central Bank, so moving the life of more than 8,000 banks in Europe to a clear direction. The words cannot be understood in another way that if you don't take immediate action and using a timeline and the intermediate checking point, banks will not cope with the challenge that we have in front of us. Of course, banks are the engine, because banks are, we can say a lot of bad things about banks. But they are the cog between the real life of people and financial markets. So they are the first one who can actually absorb a change and be the mechanism for a new paradigm, not for the benefit of the community. They have to do it for a vested interest, because it's more convenient for banks to step in this sector, like for citizens. So I really believe, David, what you said is really true. In Europe, there is a new thinking. There is in the market, we as a mortgage industry, we have more than 2,000 banks changing their best practices to capture ESG practice. The mortgage has to be seen as an intrinsic element of change in the life of people, because when you want to buy a house, renovate a house, you need finance. And if you change the way how you provide finance, you change the behavior of consumer. I would like to stop here, David, and give you back the floor, but you are right, something is changing. I would like to use the word of Galileo, eppur si muove, something is moving, and I think in the right direction. Thank you.
That's an interesting comment, because for the first time in my life, I can recall at least one institutional fund manager, a global one, had a live feed from COP26. I've never heard of that before. So you are right, something is changing. I think we can see that. Are there any other comments about Europe as perhaps a leader in what we're seeing? If not, I'll move on.
Maybe a brief one from me. Sorry, there's a little bit of a lag, but I would say in terms of what we've seen in regulatory developments, I think we've seen a lot come out of Europe, but if we kind of look at some of the statistics on kind of cumulative sustainability regulations across the world, Asia has picked up a lot. And I think there's a recognition that even though Europe has moved ahead on a lot of things, the perspective in Asia can be somewhat different, because there are considerations of we're in economies where there is increased, we start from greater fossil fuel intensity in the first place, and a lot of the economies that we are in the region are still developing. So things like energy demand is growing. There is different concerns when it comes to some of the economies in this region. And so I think that's why when we're talking about conversations with policy, taking a taxonomy as an example, there is more conversations about how do we consider that transition element when it comes to economies that are developing.
I think,
David,
go on.
Yeah, I would like to also make a comment, because I think Europe has been leading probably, but I'm not sure the gap is still as high as it used to be, because I think especially Asia Pacific is scaling up very rapidly, and we hear similar things from the US, and that's obviously where then Europe has a disadvantage, being the patchwork of countries trying to kind of get to grips with the EU regulation that needs to be implemented at country level, sometimes city level, which basically slows down the whole process. And for example, we've just kicked off yesterday a project to look at scaling up and speeding up the process to decarbonization. And what you see in Europe is the existing legacy regulation for utilities, for buildings, is basically slowing down the process. And I think also generally, but that is a global topic, I think, we need to look at how we value real estate, because all the topics we talk about today, climate change, physical risks, mitigation risks, social elements, because they are not regulated yet, they're not in a real estate valuation. And that slows down really the process of developing the business case. And I think that's something that we need to deal with collectively, because basically we're kind of showing not the real risks now, which basically slows down the process.
So how do investors think about, I guess, let's call it decarbonization, Am I right in saying that most investors see it as a cost, whereas perhaps it could be more of an opportunity? Perhaps in the way 20 or so years ago, a LEED rated building was an opportunity. Are we seeing that changing? It's easy to say it's going to cost money to reduce the carbon footprint of our buildings. We can see the taxes which are being talked about and so forth. But is it a lot more than that for our industry?
Allow me
David,
to...
I can maybe take a little stab at that. I think to Luca's point, things have changed dramatically in the last 12 to 24 months. I think if you asked that question 2 years ago, the consistent answer would be that decarbonisation is a cost. And not only is it a cost, but there's a risk associated with that cost because no one really knew how to decarbonise, how much it would cost, and whether there would actually be benefits that translate back to investors from going through the path of decarbonisation. How would it be measured? How would people price a decarbonised asset versus a traditional asset? None of that existed 2 years ago, and the change in the framework between 2 years ago and now is just chalk and cheese. And the more and more investors we talk to today are starting to see decarbonisation as an opportunity, a value opportunity rather than a cost. And it comes down to really what's driving decarbonisation in the real estate industry. I think most investors in our industry recognise that 40% of the world's carbon emissions come from the real estate and construction industry, and so it's not a matter of if, but when all of that's going to be addressed. And so the first area that pressure is coming from is just stakeholders, whether it's shareholders, whether it's lenders, whether it's tenants, whether it's the community. There's a confluence of pressure on asset owners to decarbonise their assets. I think investors are also starting to understand that the cost of not decarbonising far outweighs the cost of decarbonising. And I think that has pivoted very much in the last 12 months as people can see that they can actually price the cost of decarbonising their buildings or their campuses or whatever. And they can also price what it will look like in 5 years' time if their asset is not decarbonised, whether that's carbon taxes, whether that's more expensive financing or whatever. And then I think finally, investors are starting to appreciate the value that can be extracted from assets once an asset is decarbonised, whether that's just improved cost efficiencies, whether that's more attractive buildings for tenants who are prepared to pay higher rents, whether that's to Lizette's point that valuers are starting to apply valuation premiums to more environmentally friendly buildings. So I think it's a combination of all of those things that is leading now to investors seeing a decarbonisation initiative more as a value opportunity than simply a cost that they may or may need to undertake.
It's interesting that we're now, what's the term, stranded assets is being used to describe mostly public companies in parts of industries which are highly carbon generating. To what extent do you think that stranded assets could be an issue in our asset class in real estate?
Yeah, it's a great question, David. Stranded assets, the term traditionally was used for things like coal-fired power plants.
That's right.
And things like that. But it is very relevant, and it's interesting you made that connection back to real estate, because I think obsolescence risk is a real challenge for the real estate industry. And I think Luca mentioned this as well, that you can't necessarily look at sustainability without looking at COVID and add technology to that. Those three factors, technology, COVID, and climate change, together are going to result in a bifurcation in the industry. Asset owners who have the capital and the ability to transform their assets to make them post-COVID ready, to make them decarbonised, to enhance the technology services of a building, are going to outperform the rest of the market that don't have the capital or capabilities to do that. And there will be this bifurcation. And I do think there will result in a portfolio of assets that become obsolete and stranded. That doesn't mean they can't be repositioned later, but it will result in that bifurcation.
Well, that raises a whole host of questions. But the accelerated obsolescence, I suppose, standing back from that and thinking about not just the obsolescence, but the amount of capital which will need to be injected into the industry over the next couple of decades, really, it has huge implications. Are we on the cusp of a boom? You know, in a way, the only analogy I could think of was perhaps the post-World War II construction boom we saw in Europe, where so much redevelopment had to occur within a relatively short time period. Is this something that's on the cards?
David, allow me to step in. I think I've seen two very important comments from Neil and Lisette. Lisette said that, I mean, the valuation industries should change, and I think that's very right. We are changing the valuation methods of all the valuers in Europe to allow them for the first time to have a green parameters to be assessed in the value of the house. Also, news of a few days ago, 10 days ago, the European Commission has presented the implementation of Basel III for all the banks. And there is a little tiny line in it which says that banks can update the loan to value of the property in case of energy efficiency renovation. It's a small sentence, but it is a revolution, because all the European banks, which means 27 countries, 500 million of people, could renovate their house and get a better capital charge for banks. So banks will be cheaper for banks to have that loan. So this is a small revolution. Of course, Europe is complicated. Lisette is very true. I mean, we are 27 countries. I don't know how many regions. I mean, the Flemish they don't speak with the French, the Germans. It's like this, but something is happening where we have also cities or countries or regions imposing limit in terms of energy efficiency performance of the buildings. For example, in France, they are discussing about a new law where you cannot rent a house if it's G or F. This will have an impact on the property value of the good. But what Neil said, I think, is very important, in the sense we should not only look at the asset impact, but also the cash flow for consumers and citizens. For example, inflation in Europe is a big debate, but it's also in Brazil, is also in other parts of the world. And 50% of this inflation is due to energy cost. So if you convince a family to make energy efficiency renovation, you actually put in their pocket maybe a saving amount, cash back of 50% of how much they spend to. So it's a real money for families. It's really money. So it's not only the stranded asset, but it's a business opportunity or or an opportunity cost in terms of business opportunity for families, for banks, and for investors. Sooner or later, this will be a factor in a new business line. I think this is something we have to work together. We are working together with the Australians, with the Brazilians, because it's not a race between continents. I think it's a collaboration. We have to work together and trying to develop common standards for investors to do their due diligence, to facilitate their work. Common disclosure should be decided at the Basel level to help the world to change. Europe is only 7% of the global population. If Europe changes, no one cares. If Asia changes, if Africa changes, it makes the difference. So we have really to work together, hands in hands.
Just this opens up a huge area of discussion about what this means for investment. You know, we've touched on the need, the risks associated with portfolios, how to direct capital, whether it be new capital or repositioning assets. It's a very, very big area, and obviously a lot of thought needs to go into it. But let's just take one step back, and perhaps I'll throw the question to Hui Chin, and that is, you know, we talk about this in a broad sense, but there are also the direct climate-related or the climate change-related risks to properties, whether that be through flooding and so forth. But is this something that's material on the minds of investors at the moment? Is it becoming something that you can't simply or cheaply insure away?
Yeah, hi, David. Yes, so I think in terms of that climate change, in evaluating that 1 in 100 years floodplain, used to be, I would say just maybe a few years ago, people would say that no worry, the insurance will take care of it. You know, I just have to ask my insurance. But we have seen the increased occurrence of all these 1 in 100 years events. And certainly as investors, we are paying close attention. We are evaluating the asset physical risk assessment and also the climate change impact. And in addition, physical risk adjustments, I would say that the transition risk is equally as important. Transition risk as in how heat might be impacting. So for example, you know, how heating might be impacting the comfort levels of a building, which then increases your energy required, and then it increases your carbon emissions. So all this is actually, I think, becoming a cycle that investors pay close attention to. So as part of what we do evaluate each asset carefully, particularly the big assets, and putting in place, I would say, measures that will help safeguard the valuation of all these assets over the longer term. So I think, you know, to Luca and to Melvin's point earlier, that, you know, is there capital to actually make the change? Because I do see that, you know, Europe and Asia, particularly China, could actually be one of the game changers through regulations, through carbon tax pricing that will, I would think, probe either investors or the general public to move a little bit faster.
How, perhaps it's early days, but we're seeing governments around the world move at different paces when it comes to implementing, I guess, regulation and taxes associated with carbon. How is that? How do people feel this might translate into investment? I guess if you've got a patchwork quilt of policies, how does the investor look at it? We have, you know, carbon-related taxes which are proposed, I think, in 2 cities, at least in the US. I think New York and Boston are introducing taxes in the next year or 2. But in other parts, even of the US, you might see a very different attitude towards greening of buildings, or at least carbon. So how do you deal with this as an investor? Maybe it's a tricky topic, but it's one which I guess we would all have to confront.
So, yeah, I mean, to the question, I think it's really more asset by asset evaluation. There's really no one line that I believe investors use and say that, hey, you know, this is what we're going to do. Each asset is actually evaluated just to make sure that it fits the environment. It fits the community that the asset is supposed to serve. It fits the tenants. That's most important. Yeah.
So go on.
Oh, sorry.
No, sorry. Go ahead. So sorry.
Oh, thank you. I was just going to say just quickly that we do live in a globalized world, and one of the things that investors more broadly are thinking about is how everything's connected. How do supply chains work? So I think you start having taxes on cement, on building materials, on different areas where you do ended up, even though maybe there's policy in one jurisdiction, end up translating to another. And I think there was there's been a lot of discussion on to what extent there's extraterritorial policies, such as I think the European discussions of a cross-border adjustment mechanism. So I think we are seeing global momentum to, I think, really see some of these policies lead to extraterritorial effects.
I guess what was in the back of my mind was that Scope 2 emissions, which are basically the power drawn from the grid, will vary tremendously depending on the jurisdiction and the access to green energy. So I was just puzzled how, or if investors even think about these things yet. Mervyn, I suspect you're telling me they are thinking about these things.
Definitely are, David.
I think we do too.
I was just going to say, David, I think the scope 2 emissions are probably the easiest. And, you know, it's an area where investors and corporate occupiers are making decisions irrespective of what the government's policies are in that jurisdiction. You know, just take for example, we're working with one of the largest tech companies that owns portfolios of huge data centers all around the world across multiple jurisdictions with different government policies. And they've taken a global corporate approach that they are going to green all of their data centers. In fact, their view is not only are they going to be net zero, they're going to be negative zero. So they're going to be drawing carbon back out of the systems. But their approach is irrespective of what the government's doing in terms of in the local jurisdictions. They're going to green all their data centers, and that's going to be achieved through distributed generation. So they're signing up PPAs with renewable power generation directly into their data centers and disconnecting from the grids. And so I think to Mervyn's point, capital is global, you know, multinational corporations are global, tenants are global. And so even if scope 2 emissions are being influenced by what government policies are in each jurisdiction, scope 3 emissions are being influenced by all the interdependencies globally between tenants and occupiers and investors and developers and suppliers of cement and everything else that Mervyn mentioned. And I think that's what's going to drive the decarbonisation more so than local government policies.
It really, I think what you're saying is that the situation with an individual building is more or less unique. So you need a bespoke solution for every building in any jurisdiction, because you've got so many factors which come together to influence the outcome. It's quite a complex area. In fact, it puts a new dimension, and a very big new dimension, into the whole idea of asset management.
Yeah, David, I mean, from my side, you know, in this changing environment, I oblige myself to have at least 3 interviews with investors per week. So every week I speak with at least 3 big investors. And your comment is very right. We are moving from the nice to have box to we must have an ESG strategy. I mean, all the big houses are really putting in place severe compliance rules for making investment. So what I'm saying to my members, which are the banks issuing green bonds and those kind of things, is that you have to have a clear strategy in place, going from retail to funding strategies to be compliant with the new investor requirements. It's not only having an ad hoc issuance, which is ESG. No, investors, they want to see your mentality, your strategy on ESG. And this is, they want to see what your board is deciding. So this implies that you have to have a vision, you have to have a strategy, you have to have a tactic on ESG. It's a heavy artillery. They want to see the heavy artillery moving. So that's why I think that we are in front of a structural change, which it will impact all the big houses, asset manager in London, Paris, New York, Singapore. I mean, it is just a question of months, not maybe even weeks. But I mean, this is really a question of implementation of rules. Of course, I mean, it will not go to the speed and the path that someone was hoping in COPE, but it's moving. I mean, it's slower, it's maybe more practical, but investors are really pushing for a major IT revolution in the banking sector, where everyone has to adapt to new standards, new disclosures, new certifications that have to be produced to be compliant with the new requirements. So I think you are very right there.
Could I make a comment? Because I think what complicates matters massively is the lack of really common standards. There are so many. At building level, we have LEED, BREEAM, and then we have many local variations to that. We have a huge number of reporting frameworks from GRASP, EU, SFDR, things are coming in, and it's getting more and more and more. We spoke to some fund managers a while ago who said, well, in 2019, I got 50 requests from investors on top of the regular reporting requirements I have. Last year it was 150, and this year by April, we'd already passed that. And therefore, I think what's really needed, and also if you now see where the industry is moving, with obviously a strong focus on decarbonization, a lot of the traditional certifications don't really cover that. They focus on the capacity, the capabilities of the building, but not the true emissions. So I think it's very important to create more transparency around that, because that not even exists. Now it's just basically a jungle where investors and managers have to navigate through, which is extremely hard, because there's also no argument to say, I use this framework because it suits my strategy of that and that and that. And that's the reason why ULI, together with INREF and UNEP FI, is now starting a project to map those global, well, the main ones, I won't say all because there are probably too many, but the main building certifications, as well as portfolio reporting frameworks and tools, also including the regulatory frameworks that exist or are coming, to help at least navigate this space, and those that are involved make more thoughtful decisions on what to do and what not to do.
So I'm hearing that the infrastructure perhaps is not quite there in terms of measurement and assessment to give investors the comfort that their money is going into a true ESG or high-rated ESG product. Would that be a fair observation?
I agree. I would agree with that.
I think maybe just, sorry. I was going to say it's worth mentioning that investors' demands and needs have also been changing rapidly, because I think ESG as an industry, in terms of the things we look at, I think starting off with Scope 1 and Scope 2, we're now increasingly thinking about supply chain and Scope 3 emissions. I think moving further, we're thinking about, okay, how emissions are avoided and what opportunities are being created. And so sustainability demands, in terms of what we are getting requests from in terms of asset owners, to the sophistication of our analysis, that is all translating to kind of continual changes in what's being asked from on, be it real estate or listed equities or whoever is disclosing. And so I think we're in a world where even I think how we look at ESG and sustainability is changing. And so I imagine this is kind of one of the reasons why it's so hard to get to global standards.
Well, from what I'm hearing, is it fair to say that investors want organizations or assets to be ESG rated? And then if that's the case, then obviously convergence in standards will become a very important thing in the very near term, so that decisions can be made objectively, if nothing else.
Yeah, I think that's the idea, David, of a taxonomy, a common taxonomy. I think that Lisette raising a very important point. If we don't speak the same language, we will never understand each other. I mean, that's very much a European problem. But I mean, the taxonomy wants to be this. I mean, is the invention of the meter. Sorry to use another, but I mean. Before the French Revolution in France, they had, I think, 280 different ways of measuring the land, which was not acceptable for building a common market. You need a common meter if you want to build a market. So the taxonomy wants to be a common meter where investors can understand if something is green, not green, how green is it? You know, I mean, 1 meter is not long or is not short. Is the way how you measure I mean, it depends from your perspective. So every investors probably in the coming years will decide how much green they want to invest, but they need a meter. And the common taxonomy, we should make an effort to have a common taxonomy at global level. Doesn't make sense that we produce 10 different taxonomies around the globe. I mean, we should have a common standards to decide what is the level of ESG parameters, and that's very important. And I think that taxonomy regulation probably will be approved by the European Parliament in the coming weeks. Will be a benchmark for those kind of ideas of creating a simple unit of measurement of what is green and what is not green. I think that it's important. I will not speculate on the French concept of nuclear. I will not say anything, but I mean, it's also a big debate. I mean, sorry for the nasty comment here at the last point.
Well, I think in Asia, I can think of at least, I think 3 or 4 different measures of area, but they all can be brought back to some proportion of a square meter. But anyway, it's interesting that I think scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are fairly straightforward, at least in concept. I think, I can't remember who, but someone mentioned scope 3. Is this a headache for our industry in dealing with what if you like, our tenants are emitting? Or is this something fairly straightforward for us to get our head around and deal with in terms of ESG assessment?
I think it's really hard, David. You know, I think investors and asset owners have been getting their heads around scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And it's relatively straightforward. You know, the conversations that we have with asset owners and with corporations always start with scope 2 emissions. And then once we spend some time working through with them how to address their scope 2 emissions, it moves on to a discussion about scope 3, but it's still incredibly complex. And you know, going back to Lizette's point around measurement, the complexity around measuring scope 3 emissions is really, really hard because of all the double counting risks, all of the abstract terms. I still think the industry's quite some way away from really understanding how to identify, measure, and then address scope 3 emissions. It's a really tough topic.
So I guess it also feeds back into how do you create an ESG rating? I presume it's all linked. Yeah. Just on scope 3, I guess the logical extension of that is that I think our industry for many years has had to deal with tenants who would reject buildings because they weren't environmentally sound or energy efficient. Are we moving to a different world now where landlords would look at a tenant and see that perhaps their environmental credentials are not as good as the owners or the investors would want? Have we seen that?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting comment, David, because it comes back to the idea of societal values that Lizette talked about before. And when you think about real estate, and obviously we do this a lot with ULI and IREUS, that, you know, we look at how real estate interacts with communities and how real estate interacts with individual people. When you think about real estate as a fully integrated, living, breathing part of the community, the mix of tenants you have in an office building or a shopping centre or a mixed-use complex really does drive how that piece of asset interacts with the community. And so I think as owners become more and more proactive in placemaking and seeing how their building adds value to the community around the building and the other buildings adjacent to it, they do get a lot more selective around the tenants that they have in that building.
So, I'd like to just pick up a question which I've noticed, and it was Dr. Seek's comment on greenwashing. And the question is basically, how does the market monitor or enforce a firm's behaviour in regard, obviously, to decarbonisation? I guess that introduces the idea of holding to account. Obviously, governments can do it through taxation, but what can investors do? I think this might be a question for Luca on the debt side, perhaps to kick off with, because from my limited reading, sustainability is embedded in green loans in terms of meeting goals with regard to decarbonisation. Perhaps Luca could talk about that a little bit, and we could discuss whether or not that concept could be extended, perhaps into the equity side of investment.
Yeah, I mean, your question is on one hand very complicated, on the other hand very simple, in the sense that for me there is only one way to fix the greenwashing problem: a full transparent value chain where certifications are very clear, where standards are very clear, and investors can look on the liability on the asset side of a bank with the same understanding. Now, let's be honest, you can do green bonds that no one knows exactly what there is behind, and where there is a big proceeds discussion, where the money is invested afterwards. So only with a huge industry transparency exercise, we can fix the greenwashing problem. And as I said before, I mean, the compliance department of banks and equity asset manager are changing their policy, making very clear what are the requirements. Yes, we are in a startup phase at the global level. It's the first time that we're trying to implement something all together at the same time. So greenwashing, let me say green dressing, it's an initial phase that, I mean, everyone is trying to comply with this new request, maybe in rush, maybe not changing the IT system, and maybe not using the same certifications. You know, and the house can be A in Romania, and maybe the same house will be D in Sweden, just to give you an example on how different it can be. So we have to make an effort. But I think that the solution for greenwashing is transparency, common standards, and due diligence for investors. They can make the change in the entire value chain, because they will oblige banks and equity asset managers to change their rules internally. That's pretty clear for me.
We've got another question here. I'm not sure I fully understand it, but it's basically saying how to prevent firms from shifting pollution to poorer countries. I'm guessing what the implication here is that will investors, cross-border investors at least, perhaps start investing in countries that are not embracing green. Is that something which could happen? It surprised me. In fact, I hadn't thought of that, but I could see perhaps investors looking at mispriced assets because of let's call it the green revolution, where assets which perhaps need a lot of capital and may not be efficiently priced. Is that something perhaps our industry would be looking at, that decarbonisation might create distortions in markets that could create acquisition opportunities, perhaps in a similar way that we're seeing in the retail sector these days? So, you know, is buying...
Maybe I can just jump in on one end.
Go on.
So sorry, the lag again. I think one of the things to remember is that I think when we're talking about investors, there is usually an end asset owner at the end. And I think in part, it will depend on what their sustainability objectives are. Because if we're talking about, let's say, a kind of a large group of European asset owners, their sustainability requirements are becoming more and more sophisticated. And so I think if you're talking about, does it make sense for an asset manager to shift from one end to another, or to a kind of more polluting and developing economy, then it will depend on, I think, what the kind of end goal of that asset owner is. Because I think what we're seeing is, even if, let's say, EU rules are not being applied, or disclosure requirements are not being applied to necessarily properties in other parts of the world, as an asset manager looking after EU clients, you need to get that data in some way as part of your disclosure requirements. And so I think one of the big things is, okay, what is the end client and how much do they care about these kind of sustainability considerations?
So,
yeah, baby.
Go on.
Yeah, so maybe to chime in here, right? I think that, you know, the question actually really fits the title of the seminar well, because it says investing for good. And as investors, we need to be aware that, you know, while we all seek to have ESG goals fulfilled, there are emerging markets and there are emerging markets that perhaps needs help. And so while we pursue all these goals, right, I think, you know, it's also important for investors to understand that, you know, for example, you know, you have a coal plant and you say we shut that coal plant down in an emerging market, but the coal plant is actually jobs for the people there. So by just shutting down that coal plant, you're actually causing a different set of problems. But as investors, shouldn't we be going in and say that, you know, how do we make that transition for the coal plant to be actually more efficient? And how do we move from what we call brown assets to increasingly green assets? So I do feel that, and I do think that, you know, there is a social global responsibility for investors to also look at this kind of brown assets and how do we turn that into green. Yeah.
And I would just add to that, David, I think it just comes down to different types of investors and different pockets of capital. It's probably not too dissimilar to some investors want to invest just in very core, stabilized, well-defensive buildings, and other investors and their capital like to invest in repositionings and redevelopments and generating the returns from that. I think it's the same with decarbonisation. There are some investors that have the capital that only want to invest or lend to fully green buildings. And there are other investors that really recognise and understand the value that can be generated by decarbonising a building. And the only way to do that is to go to where the carbon is. So I think it's different strategies for different investors or different pockets of capital.
Does it have implications for our industry, I guess, as a whole? There are many examples where scale matters within real estate, whether it be sourcing tenants, sourcing inputs or whatever. But are we perhaps going to see more consolidation within our industry as the importance, you know, will scale give larger investors an advantage over smaller investors or asset managers or fund managers?
I'm happy to comment, to kick off on that. I think what we have to realize is that there's a lot happening in the real estate industry. Decarbonization obviously is a very important one, but it's not the only thing. At the same time, we see a strong transition almost from having been more of a business to business industry to a business to consumer. Ultimately, it's not only the tenant, it's also the end user of the buildings. And what we see is a huge demand for more services, more flexibility, which changes the nature of real estate investment from having been focused on long-term stable capital cash flows to much more volatile short-term cash flow model, which needs constant attention. So a much more operational focus. We think we're going to see a massive organizational transformation in the next couple of years to come. And actually, we just dedicated a chapter in the Emerging Trends report to that, where over two-thirds of respondents now see the need for that. What we think we perceive is that there is the understanding of the need for that organizational transformation. It hasn't fully landed yet what that means in terms of applying technology and innovation, hiring new skills beyond the traditional real estate skills, much more in obviously data scientists, but also hospitality, customer service staff to fundamentally transform the sector. And I think, yes, there may be, following all of that, there may be a move towards more consolidation. But I think what also will emerge at the other end is much more specialist players who are maybe good in one thing, and go in depth in the value chain, in that angle. So much more vertical integration, I think. Remember what I said at the beginning, if you really want to truly add social impact, you almost need to start at the beginning, at the planning development stage, to really work it through. And we think we see many different things which will definitely change the industry.
Oh, that's interesting. You're really saying more niche is perhaps the way we might be going, but it could be large niche. But, okay, I think we're just about out of time. I don't think there are any more. Are there any other questions from the audience? I don't see any on my screen. So if not, let me just throw one more question in. I think, Mervyn, you made the comment to me before the seminar that I think you said that science-based targets were much clearer for the public market than in the private markets. Perhaps you could expand on that. I'm curious to know what you actually meant, because when I've looked at GRESB reports, there's a lot of numbers in those reports. So I'm not sure. So,
yes, so happy to. So as an asset manager, we're signed up to decarbonize our portfolio. So we signed up to 2 initiatives, Net Zero Asset Management Initiative, as well as the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And so in terms of how we actually calculate the kind of decarbonization pathway for our portfolio, there's kind of different methodologies on offer. And so the Net Zero Asset Management Initiative is focusing on the actual emissions coming from our portfolio, whereas the Science-Based Target Initiative has a number of different methodologies, one of which is the implied temperature rise based of our portfolio. And that is based off of the targets that the companies that we have invested in have set, and how and the temperature that they align to in terms of are we pointing to a 1.5 degree world or a 2 degrees world or a 3 degrees world through the company's targets. Now, the whole framework works quite well for listed equities and credit, because it's talking about companies setting targets. It's sector relative. I think it's a relatively straightforward process. For a lot of asset classes, the methodology hasn't evolved to kind of really kind of help us understand how to compare it. So sovereigns would be an example, private assets, and real estate is one of them. And so when I'm talking about science-based targets, it's I think specifically kind of part of the Science-Based Target Initiative. I think for those of us who have signed up, and I think it's not just us, it's many asset managers and asset owners, it's how do we then think about setting our own net zero goals in a way which means that the real estate target is consistent with the sovereign's assets, with the listed assets.
Right, understood. Okay. With that, if there are no other comments or questions, who do I hand over to? Prof. Singh?
I'll take it from here. Thank you so much, David, yes, for your insights and sharing today. IREUS Director, Professor Singh Tianfu, will now give a closing address before we end for the day.
Right. Thank you, David and the panelists. I think there are many things point that we take home from this interesting sharing. From the all the comments, from the panelists, I think we become more hopeful that companies are moving toward more sustainable and more responsible way of doing business. I think there will be good kind of indication about the closing of the gap despite all this variation, transparency issue. I think we see there's a common direction. People are moving toward more responsible, more sustainable way of doing business, improving the quality of life. ESG become not something nice to have, but I think like what Luca mentioned is also a must-have in the for company thinking ahead. As we know, in terms of real estate is one of the biggest emission of carbon in the past. More than 40% of carbon emission coming from the real estate or even the household in particular. I think with this sustainable and more responsible way of investing, we probably see more and more future real estate maybe designed not just to provide the space. Maybe the future real estate may be designed to change people's behavior as well, to make people behave more responsibly and the user become more environmental friendly. With that, I would like to again thanks Dr. C for a very interesting opening remark. Things that lay down some of the ground for the discussion, and also David for moderating the session. I would like also to thank the panelists, Linset, Luca, Hui-Jin, Melvin, and Neil for very interesting kind of sharing. Last but not least, I would like to also thank my colleague from IREUS, Kochen, Wei-Chen, Noor, Naija, and also Raj and his very important team that helped to put together today's event. I hope you enjoy this event, and also like me, I would think there'll be a lot of points that actually we need to really ponder and think about moving ahead. With that, I would like to again thanks for participation in this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Singh. We would also like to thank everyone here for attending the seminar and hope that you have had an enriching afternoon. Have a wonderful evening ahead, and we look forward to having you at our future events.
I know maybe I wasn't the best behaved, but can't you see I'm trying to get up and